Hello, beautiful community. A poll is doing the rounds and making a big kerfuffle on social media about how far Russians feel morally responsible for the destruction and killing their regime is doing in Ukraine. A few of you have asked me to comment on it, and what's so striking about this poll and the accompanying article in Spiegel, where the head of Levada Center who did this poll is being interviewed and presents his analysis, very questionable analysis of the poll. What's striking about all of this is that two major faceplants are occurring on the internet about this. So let's just look at the most catchy snippet from that poll that's been doing the rounds, and it's this. Do people like you, Russians, bear any responsibility for the deaths of civilians and destruction in Ukraine? And 59% of Russians said, I don't feel morally responsible. And 34% of Russians said, I do feel morally responsible. So what's happened? The internet, particularly the internet in Eastern Europe, has broken out saying, look at these Russians, they are so morally reprehensible, the majority of them don't take responsibility. It's the first of the two faceplants. That poll is utterly extraordinary if it were true, which it isn't. But it would be utterly extraordinary if a third of Russians living in a quasi-totalitarian, partly totalitarian society in which criticism of the government is both criminalized and socially disparaged, if a third of Russians said, I feel morally responsible for the bad things my government is doing, that would be an absolutely extraordinary moral triumph for Russia. Russia would morally elevate itself above the rest of the world with such an outcome. And of course, in that context, it's particularly humiliating that thousands of people have been ventilating themselves saying, oh, look at this shows how Russians don't take responsibility. It shows the very opposite. It's an extraordinarily remarkable result, which of course leads to the second faceplant. That result ain't true, right? Or at least what we might think that means, it certainly doesn't mean. I mean, the idea that a third of Russians feel morally responsible for the bad things that their government is doing in Ukraine, of which they're critical, let's say, that is just pie in the sky. That is completely unbelievable. And that is the second faceplant. So the people who were saying this poll looks really bad for Russia have faceplanted. And the people who are saying that this poll looks really good for Russia have also faceplanted. Now, the number of people who might really feel that the war is wrong and who might feel a really deep moral responsibility for it would be small, that feel it very, very intensely, but it would be small. I don't know what it is. But we'd be looking at, a very impressive outcome if it just about staggered into the double digits of percentage points. That's it. So let's dance a little bit around this and help ourselves understand this more, because you often encounter polls coming out of Russia and it's nearly impossible for you to judge what they mean. And let me just put three things on the table very quickly. What kind of a conversation is this, firstly, that we're having? It's a conversation about whether the social attitudes of Russians are radically different to the social attitudes of, let's say, us in the West. What kind of conversation are we going to very briefly have here? Well, it's a conversation that isn't a comment on a poll, but is a comment on commenting on polls. Right. And the third thing is that if you're going to take anything away from it, is to be very skeptical of your own capacity to evaluate a poll coming out of Russia, partly because they are of limited use, they are very epistemically wonky, and I certainly don't feel able to evaluate polls coming out of Russia. And you know, I have a history of participating in academic life around politics, and even indeed for a while around comparative politics. So, and I wouldn't even begin claiming that I could evaluate these polls. So let's put a few things down on the table that problematize polling in Russia, maybe arrive at the most interesting point at the end, or just jump through the others, which I've jotted down so I don't forget to tell you about them. Now, polling in Russia is a minor form of terror, because you get a call in a culture where the preponderance of belief is that pollsters somehow represent the government, or somehow connected with the government, and they're asking you whether you support government policy. So it is indeed a mild form of terror that's going to dramatically disfigure what kind of response is going to come if you compare that to doing the same kind of thing in a democratic society. Now, experts also tend to agree that Russians use polls as a feedback mechanism for the regime because there is no other way of legally communicating back that you're unhappy about something. So that's a feature of polls in Russia that might not be a feature on the same kind of level of polls in, Denmark or Sweden. Then, pulling in the opposite direction, most Russians try to ally, or at least a large minority of Russians, or most Russians, try to align themselves not so much with what the majority thinks, but with what the majority thinks the majority thinks. And that's, of course, a problem, that there is this tendency to perhaps overestimate how many people support Putin, in your building. But there's this real tendency, which pulls in the opposite direction of this critical feedback mechanism, to just say, well, hang on, I'm just going to give the answer that most safely aligns with majority opinion. Response rate is often very low, and that skews things. And how the data is processed and curated is often worth looking at, and would often lead you to conclude that the poll results should be taken with greater skepticism. But let's now arrive at the main fundamental point. And perhaps I'll mention it directly and then abstract away from it into a couple of generalizations. Very few Russians are for or against Russia's war in Ukraine. What Russians are for or against fundamentally is Putin, or at least Putin as a certain kind of institution that happens to be partly embodied in a single individual. And as many people like to point out, if Putin decided before February 24, 2022, to indeed give territory to Ukraine rather than invading Ukraine, if he decided to give back territory to Ukraine, it's Greg Yudin and some other people have pointed out, Greg Yudin is a lovely political philosopher of the younger generation in Russia, the support would have been the same. So what Russians are supporting isn't a particular policy, they are supporting the source of the policy. So they're going to support Putin if he does A, but they're also going to support Putin if he does the opposite of A. And so that is very, very important. And it leads us, I think, to an important observation. And that's that to make sense of a poll, and indeed to even conduct a poll adequately, you need two things. You need an understanding of the limits of universal method and universal interpretation in this practice. That You've got to recognize that if you ask, Brits or Americans if they're in favor of the pulling out of Afghanistan, the meaning of that interaction, you asking them that and them answering you, is very different to the meaning of that interaction with a Russian about Russia's foreign policy, simply because the Brit or the American would actually give you an answer in terms of the policy, whereas the Russian respondent most of the time would not actually be giving you an answer in terms of the policy. They'd be giving you an answer in terms of the source that generated the policy. It's a fundamental difference. So what that means is that there are complexly contextual, anthropological assumptions that we've got to first of all get right before we begin conducting and making sense of polls. First, and second, we've got to work out what that particular cultural context, cultural contextuality is in each given case. So there's two things. One is this general principle that there's going to be a very radical limit on how far you can go around asking the same question in different cultures and think that's the same kind of enterprise. And then you've got to figure out what that means in particular. And this is a difficult problem that we all experience very widely. I mean, I remember in somewhere between the late 90s and the early 2000s, I was particularly interested in human rights discourse, and I was following the evolution of human rights discourse. And when I was a moronic 20-year-old, I even hired the largest theater in town to give a 3-hour human rights lecture. I was following human rights discourse closely. One of the things that was interesting was how women in societies where they were on the wrong end of enormous injustice and violence and structural injustice, didn't want to come out of that by simply buying the full package of Western rights that NGOs would often discourse in terms of. So just take an example. A practice like female genital mutilation would often be misunderstood because Western NGOs would want to discourse in terms of that being a gross violation of women's dignity. But in different cultural contexts, women would tend to think of their dignity in terms of various kinds of social recognition and social belonging. And therefore they thought that this practice was absolutely appalling, but they didn't want to protest against it in terms of the concept of dignity. And so therefore, if you said to women, does this practice violate your dignity? And the answer came back no, you'd be terribly wrong to conclude from that they think the practice is remotely okay. Yeah. But that's the kind of conclusion you might jump to. Or for instance, if you go around, in a very highly familiarly dense collective culture, and you say, well, what's your relationship, kiddo, with mum and dad? And they say, well, I don't see mum and dad that often. You might think the family structure is broken down in that society, but in fact it's that they just hang out with their aunties and uncles who help the parenting process. So unless you know that particular context, you can't really evaluate questions that on the face of it, right, seem questions that we could easily understand. Therefore, all of this stuff that's broken out about this particular poll is quite epistemically embarrassing on all sides. And the interpretation of a poll like that is so nuanced that it's just going to be simply beyond the reach of even people with postgraduate degrees in politics. And therefore, you're just seeing pure instrumentalization of this stuff on Twitter and so on. And therefore my advice, and this is an extraordinary circuitous way of answering the question, is if anything like the result this poll indicated were true, then, oh my, that would actually be a very positive thing, not the negative thing people are making it out to be. But if we look at the details of that poll, and that's something we're not qualified to do, we're not going to do, we would find why that result is so implausible. But abstracting away from the poll itself and looking at my own historically informed and intuitive understanding of Russian society, the idea that a third of Russians are feeling really bad about destruction in Ukraine is just utterly implausible. That is far too high, hence the double faceplant. This was really pushing our luck here, this kind of long quasi-social scientific ramble. So we're going to restore order next time and be more concrete. Lots of love. Talk soon.